I have some fun Ghost Party quilt cutting tips to share with you today. So let's get started. Here I have 3 fat quarters stacked on top of each other. That's about as many as I feel comfortable cutting at once. You could do 1 at once or more than 3, whichever you feel comfortable with. I just find that this is the least amount of shifting for me when I use 3. So first I'm going to cut a registration side. So this just gets everything lined up perfectly straight. And I just cut that real quick, and then I'm going to align my ruler along that edge and complete the bottom as well into a perfectly cut straight line, so that's where I'm going to start from. So here we go. I had to go around a little bit on the opposite side there, so you will find that I did actually cut this on the opposite side I'm used to working with, but that's okay. So this is a good time to talk about the Stripology ruler. This is not sponsored or anything. I love a good Stripology ruler. This is it right here. And it is a little bit too shallow to cut the strips going across the fat quarter. A Stripology ruler basically is this big ruler that has cut marks at every ½ an inch. And so it makes it easy to cut strips down into smaller pieces. So I will show you that at a later time after I cut my strips. But for cutting the strips, I'm just going to line it up and cut my height that I need here. And then I'm not going to move that strip out of the way. You are welcome to, whatever you feel comfortable with, but I'm just going to move up and cut the next strip and keep them in line with where I originally cut them, so that I can go back and subcut them down into squares. So in order to know how many squares you need from each fabric, you just take the amount of squares for, this is the Ghost Party body, and you divide it by how many fabrics you have. So I have 10 Ghost Party body fabrics, so I am going to actually cut, I believe I need 18 of each of the fabrics for piece A squares. And then as you can see here, I'm showing you the pattern to explain that there are a few other pieces that you would cut out unless you want to FPP. I think if you FPP, you only have to cut out piece B's. Actually, you can FPP that too. But if you're not FPPing, you would use this top portion of the fabric to FPP all those pieces or cut out all your additional pieces. So I'm going to take my ruler now, and this is where I cut it, my registration side on the wrong side, because now I'm going to be cutting backwards. But since all my strips are lined up, I'm just going to put my ruler so I can cut my squares and cut through all 3 strips of fabric and get my stacks of squares that way. So once I finish that, I will show you how I organize my squares over to the side here. So again, I'm just cutting, going down the strips. For a fat quarter strip, you will get roughly 6 squares per strip. A fat quarter is half the width salvage to salvage. So that typically is between 20 and 22 inches. And if it's on the short side, depending on the salvage, you may only get 5 squares per width of fat quarter. It's a little bit different for a ½ yard. So I will show you that. I'm going to share cutting a ½ yard with you in a little bit because Wyndham Fabrics sent me both. So this fabric is from Wyndham Fabrics. They sent me a bunch of painter's palette fabric and a few other mixed in there that I'm making this quilt for, and then we're going to give it away on Woolly Petals at the end of the sew along. It'll be open to anybody, but I hope all of you enter as well. It would be a fun extra Ghost Party quilt, or you could give it away. So I'm cutting my last strip here, and as you can see, as I was stacking the little piles of squares, because remember I have 3 fabrics lined up here. I just am keeping those 3 fabrics together and I am stacking them over in a line. So how I organize fabric is as I'm cutting, I have 9 piles of squares, 1 for each ghost in the quilt, so I can evenly distribute the fabric as I cut it. So then I can have the evenly distributed fabric for each ghost in the pattern instead of worrying about when I get to my last ghost, I might have too many of one fabric and not enough of another. So I moved my piles over so you could see, and I kept, again, all my little squares in their piles of 3 so that I can just take each pile of 3 and individually distribute it onto my piles of 9, 1 for each ghost. And I just keep going until I run out of little piles of 3. You would do the same thing for your extra pieces if you are traditionally piecing instead of paper piecing. All those eyes, mouth, and then the points at the bottom of the ghost can also be foundation paper pieced or traditionally pieced. So you can kind of see my little piles of different pieces. I believe piece B through G, I don't have the pattern right in front of me, are sitting over there waiting to be traditionally pieced. And I would do the same thing, divide that number of how many I need total for the quilt by the amount of fabrics and cut them out and keep them in piles. Next, we're going to switch over to fun background fabrics. These are fat quarters as well, and I stacked 3 up. I'm going to make my registration cut along the side that is better for me because I'm right-handed. And then we're going to do the exact same thing, but I'm going to show you how to use a stripology ruler on this one. Again, just for review, that registration cut gives me a nice crisp edge that is straight, and I use that to line up my ruler to cut a straight edge along the bottom. And then I can go back and cut all of my strips for my pattern. Okay, so I am again just cutting my strips by width of fat quarter, which is about 20 to 22 inches. So I only need 2 strips from these background fabrics because Wyndham sent me, you saw that little flash of fabric there, 28 different fabrics. So when I did my calculations, I only need about 10 from each fabric. And it might vary a little bit from that. I'm just doing general math here. So I'm cutting out my strips here, and I'm going to grab my stripology ruler. So this is not sponsored, but a stripology ruler is kind of an awesome tool if you're cutting a lot of squares and pieces down from strips. It has cutting marks from 0 to 20 on every ½ inch so that as you're going down, you could cut 3 inches and cut a bunch of those before you have to lift the ruler up. So ultimately, you want to line up the 0 with your registration edge. Sometimes I tuck it in just a tiny bit and recut that registration edge, like literally a 64th inch away. And then I'm just going to kind of go down the line and cut my fabric into squares by cutting on each slot. So I'm going to do 3½ inches for the first square, and then I'm going to go 3½ inches further and 3½ inches further. So there is a little bit of math involved. You could put a little piece of tape if you want to do the math ahead of time. But it is quick and you don't have to move your ruler at all. You just want to line up one of the horizontal lines on the stripology ruler with the line of your fabric so that you get a perfectly straight cut. And so I'm doing my cuts here across, and you can see it's going to go pretty quickly here, but I do make a mistake because I didn't add properly or put my rotary cutter in the right line. Hazards of filming and talking and trying to figure it out. I am doing a voiceover because the audio ended up not being very good on the video. So I'm going to pull apart now, and you'll see all my little squares that I'm going to line up. And there's my mistake. I cut it at 2½ instead of 3½. Not a big deal. Definitely something to pay attention to when you're cutting, but I have extras here at the end, and I will be able to use that mistake for cutting my piece B's from, and then use that extra at the end to cut the additional pieces. And I'm just going to grab my regular ruler and cut it out here. I am just double checking with my ruler that it's the same size as a Stripology. I think most rulers are, but some vary the tiniest bit. So I would always recommend checking your ruler to a Stripology, as well as using just one ruler for cutting your whole project out. So I organize my fabric for my background the same way I organize my fabric for the ghost body in 9 piles. And I'm going to evenly distribute the background fabric among those piles as I cut, so that I can evenly distribute the fabric throughout the whole quilt. There's nothing worse than just pulling from a pile of fabric for all your blocks, ghost blocks, and then at the end, like your last block, you have like a lot of a couple fabrics and none of other fabrics, because you use those in blocks at the beginning and used it all up, because sometimes we definitely gravitate towards one fabric or 2 fabrics more than others, and we tend to pull those more. So my last little cutting share here is going to be a full half yard. So Wyndham did cut this at the fold, but it is technically a full half yard. And I'm sharing this because if this, where I'm pulling it apart with my hands, if this was a fold and I wanted to cut by width, I wouldn't open this up so it's like the 40 or 42 inches wide. I keep it folded at that fold as it comes off the bolt, and I would line one of the lines on my ruler up on that fold to cut across the bottom to make a straight edge. And I would then cut my strips going up the half yard or full yard, keeping that line aligned on the fold as well. And that's kind of my registration side. So because they did cut this, I'm going to trim just a tiny bit off. It's almost perfectly straight, but not quite. So I do want to make sure that it is perfectly straight. And then I'm going to do the same thing. You get more squares clearly out of a full width of fabric, and that is often mentioned in patterns as WOF, with width of fabric, because a fat quarter is only half the width. And it is pertinent to note that different fabric manufacturers have different widths of fabric. Some fabric manufacturers probably clock in right around 40 inches wide, not including salvages. And other fabric manufacturers will be more like 42, and some can even go up to 43 and 44. So you will get a varying amount of squares out of a width of fabric or a fat quarter width based on the manufacturer. I was actually able to get 12 squares out of the Wyndham widths of fabric, where I typically use 11 as my maximum, because some manufacturers have smaller widths that in patterns, when I'm doing fabric amounts, I don't want to overpromise how much fabric you need and then under deliver. Does that make sense? So because I'm FPPing my stars, I am leaving that whole top piece intact, and I'm going to use that for FPP. I'm going to distribute my fabric among my 9 piles of background fabric evenly, and that again will help when I make the pattern. I will just grab a pile of background fabric and a pile of ghost body fabric and use those for my blocks. Now I have to cut a piece B from this fabric as well, and because I only need one, I am going to cut it from only one of these fabrics, so I pull back the other. And I realized I should go from the other side because that's the side that actually has the straight edges, so I can just quickly cut it out. Now I'm just going to cut it out of here because I'm using the rest of this fabric to FPP, not a big deal. If you want to have a nice clean edge on fabric you're putting back in your stash, you could cut across the whole width of fabric like one of my friends does, and then cut your piece out and then put that extra strip into your scrap, or cut it down into squares and put them in your bins, and then you have a nice straight edge when you go to sew. So that's it. That's how I cut. Please ask any questions on Instagram and your week 1 post about cutting. And I know Cool People Quilt will have some cool tips too. And we can't wait to see what your quilts look like and see you cutting them out.